At a small town ceremony, Keanu spots an old soldier standing alone, clutching a photo no one else sees. Forgotten by his family, invisible to his neighbors, he carries a battle no medal ever honored. But what Keanu discovers next will change not just one life, but an entire town's forgotten soul. The order blows up. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The autumn air carried the smell of damp leaves and distant bonfire smoke as Keanu Reeves stepped out of the rented van. The Veterans Day event wasn't much. A folding table with paper flags, a few metal chairs, and a crooked banner strung between two trees. But the people gathered in the tiny town square wore their best clothes, eyes folded respectfully over their hearts, eyes bright with gratitude. Keanu wasn't here for publicity. He was visiting small towns quietly for the foundation, hoping to hear real stories, not polished speeches. As he scanned the modest crowd, his gaze landed on a figure standing apart from the others. Walter Briggs. He wasn't hard to notice once you really looked. Older, yes. Lines carved deep around his mouth and forehead. But it wasn't just age. It was something heavier. His clothes were clean but threadbare. A battered brown jacket clung to his thin frame, and in his weathered hands he clutched a crumpled black and white photo like it was the last piece of something he couldn't bear to lose. People mingled around him, laughing quietly, sharing warm cider and memories, but no one approached Walter. Not a handshake, not a nod, not even a glance. Keanu watched as Walter's eyes flicked across the crowd, hopeful for a second, then dimming. He stood rooted to the edge of the celebration like a man caught between two worlds, the one he left behind and the one that had moved on without him. Something inside Keanu shifted. It would have been easy to stay near the podium, to thank the organizers politely, to leave with a few photos for the foundation's newsletter. But that wasn't why he was here. Without thinking, Keanu grabbed 2 paper cups of steaming coffee from a nearby table and started walking away from the crowd toward the lonely figure no one else seemed to see. As he got closer, he noticed the tremor in Walter's hands. The photograph he held was old, its edges worn thin, the image slightly faded but still clear enough. A group of young soldiers, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning in the sun, pride and youth frozen in time. Walter clutched that photo against his chest, as if it were armor against the cold world. Keanu slowed his steps. He didn't want to startle him. He just wanted to be near, to listen. He offered a coffee without saying a word. Walter looked up sharply, suspicion flashing in his tired blue eyes. Then, slowly, something softer crossed his face. He reached out with shaking fingers and took the cup. Still, neither of them spoke. Sometimes, Keanu knew, words weren't the first thing needed. Sometimes, it was simply choosing to stand beside someone who thought the world had forgotten them. Walter wrapped his hands around the coffee like it was a rare treasure. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, the noise of the crowd muffled by the distance they had created. Keanu shifted his stance slightly, careful not to invade Walter's space. He glanced again at the photograph and this time caught a detail he hadn't noticed before. A small, handwritten note along the bottom edge. Bravo Company, 1969. Walter caught him looking and gave a short, dry laugh. Most of them didn't make it, he said, his voice rough as gravel but steady. Some of us did. Sometimes. You wonder, which is the heavier burden? Keanu didn't answer, he just listened. Walter tucked the photo back into the inner pocket of his jacket, pressing it close to his heart. I don't come for the speeches, he said, staring past the crowd, or the flags. I come because, well, somebody has to remember. His eyes tracked the families gathered around the tables, their easy laughter, the clink of coffee cups, the bright chatter of grandchildren unaware of what it had cost to give them such peace. I had a family once, Walter said quietly. wife, 2 boys, a little girl. They held on longer than most would have, longer than I deserved. Keanu felt the ache in those words like a physical thing. Walter shrugged, a broken kind of gesture. But war doesn't always kill you out there. Sometimes it follows you home, takes pieces of you so small you don't even notice until nothing fits together anymore. The words hung between them, heavy as lead. Keanu knew better than to offer platitudes, better than to say he understood when he hadn't walked that exact road. He just stood there, coffee cooling in his hand, a silent witness to a story too big to be crammed into speeches or ceremonies. After a while, Walter's shoulders relaxed slightly. Not much, just enough. "You're not from around here," Walter said, studying him with a narrowed gaze. Keanu smiled gently. "Just passing through." Walter grunted. "Most do." Keanu tipped his head toward the photo hidden in Walter's jacket. "Looks like you stayed." Walter's mouth twisted into something that might once have been a smile. "Didn't know where else to go." Another silence. But this one wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when 2 people stop pretending they're strangers. A slight breeze kicked up, rattling the loose edges of the event banner. A few flags fluttered in their holders. Somewhere, a child laughed. Walter watched it all, expression unreadable. "Funny thing," he said after a long moment. "You spend your life thinking you're invisible. Then one day someone shows up, and you don't know whether to be grateful or scared to death." Keanu chuckled softly. "Maybe both." Walter's lips twitched again. He lifted his cup in a kind of salute, a silent thank you, and took a slow sip of the cooling coffee. For the first time in a long time, Walter Briggs wasn't standing alone. The ceremony wore on, but neither Walter nor Keanu moved. They watched from the edges, 2 figures in quiet observation rather than participation. At one point, the mayor stepped up to the microphone and gave a spirited speech. He spoke of sacrifice and courage. He spoke of never forgetting. Keanu noticed how Walter's jaw tightened slightly, a twitch of something too complicated to name. "The Mother, they say." "The words," Walter murmured, almost to himself. "But they don't see the faces." Keanu turned toward him. "Tell me about them," he said softly. Walter hesitated, the weight of memory pulling him back. Finally, he shook his head. "Another time," he said, but his voice was different now, less guarded, more vulnerable, like some part of him wanted to believe there would be another time, that someone would stay long enough to ask again. Keanu didn't press. He just nodded, accepting the offering for what it was. After the final notes of taps faded into the November sky, the crowd began to disperse. Families gathered their things. Flags were folded. Children were ushered toward cars. Within minutes, the small plaza emptied, leaving only scraps of paper and half-deflated balloons tethered to the backs of chairs. Walter remained seated on the bench, his photo still hidden away, but his posture no longer quite so closed. Keanu stood and stretched, then looked down at him. "Mind if I come back sometime?" Walter squinted up at him, the sun carving deep lines into his weathered face. There was a long pause, filled with things neither man could quite say. Finally, Walter gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You do what you want," he said, but there was no bitterness in it, no dismissal. Only permission. Keanu smiled. "I'll see you around, Walter." He started walking away, leaving space, giving the man his dignity. But halfway across the lot, he glanced back over his shoulder. Walter was still there, watching him go. And for just a second, Keanu thought he saw something flicker across the old soldier's face. Hope. It wasn't big, it wasn't loud, but it was there. And that was enough. Keanu turned the corner and disappeared into the lengthening shadows, already planning his next visit, already knowing deep in his bones that this wasn't a chance encounter. It was the beginning of something that neither of them knew they had needed so badly. Keanu showed up the next Tuesday, same time, same place. There was no big announcement, no phone call ahead of time. Just a quiet arrival and a slow walk across the small plaza where the leftover Veterans Day decorations still clung to the lampposts. Walter was already there, sitting stiffly on the same weathered bench. His battered photo rested in his hands again, cradled like something sacred. Without asking, Keanu sat down at the other end of the bench, giving Walter space. For a few long minutes, neither man said anything. The sounds of the town floated around them. Cars passing, a dog barking down the street, the distant hum of life continuing. Finally, Keanu spoke, his voice low and easy. "They look like good men." Walter didn't look up. He just stared at the photo, his fingers brushing the faded edges. "They were," he said. His voice was rough, like gravel worn down by years of storms. Keanu nodded slowly. "You were with them in Vietnam?" Walter gave a short grunt that could have meant yes or maybe or leave me alone. But he didn't move away. He didn't get up and leave. Keanu took it as a sign to stay. He leaned back against the bench, letting the silence stretch between them like a bridge being built one plank at a time. No rush, no pressure. After a while, Walter spoke again, so quietly that Keanu had to lean in slightly to hear. "Lost 3 of them in one night. We were just trying to get back to the river." He said it like it was the weather, like it was something anyone might say about a storm that rolled through and took half the town with it. Keanu didn't offer any easy words. He didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss," or "they're in a better place." He just sat there, grounded, letting Walter's truth stand on its own. Walter shifted slightly, adjusting the old army jacket he wore. As he moved, Keanu noticed a patch sewn onto the inside lining, small, frayed, but still recognizable. A military unit insignia, infantry division. Keanu glanced at it, then back at Walter. "You kept it all these years." Walter shrugged one shoulder, the motion weary. "Some things you don't leave behind, even when everything else leaves you." The words settled heavily between them. Keanu felt them land in his chest, raw and undeniable. He thought of the medals some soldiers wore, polished and gleaming. But this battered photo, this worn patch, this was real valor. The kind that didn't fit neatly into speeches or ceremonies. "You ever talk to anyone about it?" Keanu asked gently. Walter let out a brittle laugh. "Tried once. They told me I was lucky to make it back. Told me to count my blessings." His mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Didn't feel much like a blessing at the time. Keanu didn't flinch. He just nodded, absorbing every word, honoring it the only way he knew how, by listening, really listening, without trying to fix it or explain it away. Walter shifted the photo slightly, holding it up so the light caught the faces a little better. "That's Charlie," he said, tapping a finger against one of the figures. "Funniest guy you'd ever meet. Used to sneak chocolate bars into camp." He pointed again. "Mendez. Smart as a whip. Could fix anything with duct tape and a prayer." His voice softened when he touched the last face. "And that's Riley. My best friend. Didn't make it home." The words broke off, swallowed by a silence that felt sacred. Keanu looked at the faces, memorizing them, feeling their presence like a weight and a warmth at the same time. The movie mattered, Keanu said simply. Walter turned his head then, really looking at him for the first time. His eyes were tired, wary, but something flickered behind them, something almost like gratitude. "Yeah," Walter said hoarsely. "They did. And for the first time in a very long time, someone had said it with him. Not for show, not for ceremony, but because it was true." They sat there as the afternoon sun dipped lower, 2 men sharing a silence filled not with emptiness, but with remembrance. Walter folded the photo carefully, tucking it back into his jacket like a promise kept. And Keanu knew in the marrow of his bones that he wasn't going anywhere. Walter Briggs had been fighting his battles alone for too long. Not anymore. The next Tuesday, Keanu showed up again. No camera crews, no fanfare, just a man with 2 coffees and time to give. Walter was there. Same spot, same photo, tucked carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket. When Keanu handed him one of the coffees, Walter took it without a word, but this time he nodded slightly. A small acknowledgement. A brick removed from the invisible wall between them. They sat side by side on the worn wooden bench as the town bustled faintly around them. A delivery truck rumbled down the street. Children's laughter echoed from the schoolyard 3 blocks over. Life moved on. But on that bench, time slowed. Keanu sipped his coffee and then asked, casually, "You have family nearby?" Walter's hand tightened around the coffee cup. His shoulders stiffened, but he didn't shut down entirely. Instead, he answered after a long pause, his voice flat and worn. "Had a wife once. Lisa, good woman. Tried hard. Tried real hard." Keanu waited, knowing better than to push. "Had 2 boys. And a girl. Sarah." Walter's mouth twitched, like the words tasted bitter and sweet at the same time. "They were small when I got home. Real small. Didn't understand why their old man would yell sometimes, or why he couldn't sleep, or why he'd sit in the dark for hours." He laughed dryly. "Truth is, I didn't understand it either." Keanu's heart squeezed. He thought about all the soldiers whose battles didn't end when the shooting stopped. The ones who carried wars home inside their heads, invisible and misunderstood. "Lisa tried to hold us together," Walter said. "But I wasn't easy to live with. Anger, guilt. It eats at you. Makes you say things you don't mean. Do things you can't take back." He stared out across the small plaza, eyes unfocused. They left one by one, Lisa first. Then the boys stopped calling. Sarah hung on the longest. He swallowed hard. "Last time I saw her, she was about 16. Had her mother's stubborn chin. She said, 'Daddy, I don't know who you are anymore.'" Walter rubbed his palm across the top of his thigh, an old nervous habit. "I told her to go. Told her she'd be better off. And she listened," he whispered, almost to himself. "Smart girl." The sorrow in his voice was so raw that Keanu had to look away for a moment, steadying his own emotions before they could betray him. "You were protecting them," Keanu said quietly. Walter snorted. "I was protecting myself." Didn't want to see the disappointment in their eyes anymore. The wind stirred, lifting dry leaves along the sidewalk. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Walter reached into his coat and pulled out the battered photo again. Only this time, it wasn't the one of his unit. It was a different picture. A family portrait, faded and wrinkled. A younger Walter, wearing civilian clothes that hung awkwardly on his frame, sat beside a smiling woman with kind eyes and 3 small children crowded around them. The boys looked mischievous. The girl, tiny and serious, clutched a stuffed rabbit in one hand. "My wife took this before everything went sideways," Walter said. Keanu studied the picture, feeling the weight of it. The life that could have been, the life that still might be, if someone believed it wasn't too late. He looked at Walter, really looked at him. "I think they still love you," Keanu said, voice steady. Walter shook his head, a sad, resigned smile pulling at his mouth. "Love don't survive a ghost, son." Keanu didn't argue. He just tucked the moment into his heart, knowing that sometimes people didn't need to be told they were wrong. They needed someone willing to stay anyway. And Keanu was staying. Over the next several days, Keanu couldn't get Walter out of his mind. He found himself researching quietly at night, scrolling through articles about veterans like Walter, stories of men who had returned from war carrying invisible injuries no one knew how to heal. It wasn't just sadness that clung to them. It was shame, confusion, guilt, heavy chains that grew heavier when no one dared to ask why they were there in the first place. At the next town event, Keanu made sure to stop by the bench again. As expected, Walter was there, coffee already cooling beside him, staring into the distance like he was still waiting for a bus that would never come. This time, Keanu sat down without saying anything. He simply waited, and slowly Walter started to talk again. He spoke of the jungle heat in Vietnam, of nights spent listening for footsteps in the dark. He spoke of the faces he still saw when he closed his eyes, friends he couldn't save, mistakes he could never forget. Keanu listened. No judgment, no fixing, just presence. As the afternoon wore on, Keanu noticed something else too. Walter's hands trembled slightly when he tried to hold his coffee. His shoulders seemed to droop under the weight of more than just memories, and when he stood, Keanu saw the faint wince of old injuries that had never fully healed. This wasn't just a man weighed down by grief. This was a man who had been fighting a private war for decades and losing more often than winning. Keanu made a quiet decision then. He wasn't just going to listen. He was going to help Walter find a way back, even if it took months, even if it took years, even if Walter himself didn't believe it was possible yet. The next time Keanu met with Sophia at the foundation office, he brought it up gently. "There's a man," he said, keeping Walter's name private for now. "Vietnam vet. Seems like he's been forgotten by everybody." Sophia leaned in, listening the way she always did when something mattered. "What do you need?" she asked. Keanu thought for a long moment before answering. "Not much at first," he said. "A little hope, a little kindness, a way to remind him he's still here." Sophia smiled softly. "I think we can manage that." It was a small beginning, but sometimes the hardest battles start with the smallest steps. And Keanu had already decided. Whatever Walter needed to find his way back to life, he wasn't going to have to walk that road alone anymore. Later that night, Keanu sat at his kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the quiet house. He thought about Walter, about the lines etched deep into his face, about the battered photograph he clutched like it was the only proof he'd ever loved or been loved. There were so many like him, Keanu realized, men and women carrying wars inside them, invisible to the world, their strength never recognized, their battles fought in silence long after the flags had been folded and the parades had ended. He opened his laptop and logged into the Foundation's forum, a place built to tell stories that usually went untold. He didn't name Walter. He didn't need to. Instead, he wrote, "Today I met a man who reminded me that the greatest strength often goes unnoticed. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't ask for recognition. He simply carried the weight of what he lived through, quietly, with dignity. I wonder how many silent heroes we pass by every day without ever realizing it. Have you ever known someone whose silent strength deserved to be honored?" He posted it and sat back, unsure if anyone would respond. The first comment came within minutes. "My grandfather fought in Korea. Never talked about it. When he passed, we found a box under his bed, full of medals he never showed anyone. He thought he didn't deserve them. I wish I had told him he did." Another followed quickly. "My mother battled cancer for 8 years without ever letting on how scared she was. She went to every school play, every soccer game. I only realized after she passed how much strength that took." And another, "My older brother came home from Iraq and never quite came home. He's been fighting every day since. I see it in the way he holds his breath before walking into a crowded room. I see it in the way he flinches when fireworks go off. He's my hero, even if he doesn't see it." The comments poured in, raw and beautiful. Some spoke of veterans, some spoke of single parents, some spoke of teachers, neighbors, strangers who had left quiet imprints on their lives. Keanu read each one, feeling the weight of their truths. But it wasn't just about war. It was about resilience. It was about people who carried burdens without applause, who showed up even when no one asked them to, who stayed standing when the world gave them every reason to fall. A comment stopped Keanu scrolling. Not all medals are worn around the neck. Some are carried inside the heart. He read it again and again. The words wrapped around his chest, pulling something loose inside him. Walter didn't need a ceremony. He didn't need a parade. He needed to know that his survival mattered. That someone saw him, not just for what he lost, but for what he endured. Keanu made a silent vow that night. Walter Briggs would not be forgotten, not if he had anything to say about it. And maybe, just maybe, by telling Walter's story, others would remember the quiet heroes in their own lives too. Heroes who never asked to be celebrated. Yes, only to be seen. Only to be remembered. The next morning, Keanu woke to find the forum flooded with hundreds more comments. Overnight, Walter's silent strength had rippled across thousands of strangers' hearts. Stories came from every corner of life. A woman wrote about her father, a firefighter who never spoke of the children he couldn't save, but who still showed up for every shift. A young man shared about his neighbor, a World War II veteran, who spent his retirement fixing bikes for neighborhood kids, never asking for a dime. One teenager posted simply, "My mom raised 3 of us alone after my dad left. I thought that was normal. Now I know it was heroic." Keanu spent hours reading, heartful, eyes burning. It was strange how pain could link strangers across distance and years. How resilience could feel like a secret code, written into the small choices people made every day to keep going when they didn't have to. As he scrolled, he started noticing patterns. Many talked about small acts of grace, a kind word at the right time, a hand on the shoulder when it was needed most, a smile that said, "You're not alone." Walter, he realized, was part of that chain. He had been carrying not just his own sorrow, but the invisible weight of everyone who had ever fought and fallen quietly. The more Keanu thought about it, the clearer it became. Walter wasn't just a forgotten veteran. He was a living reminder that survival, in its own way, was a kind of victory. That night, Keanu picked up his notebook and began sketching out ideas. He didn't want to rush Walter into anything. Healing, he knew, couldn't be forced. It had to be offered, gently, like an open hand instead of a demand. But maybe, just maybe, Walter's story could be a bridge. Maybe there were others who needed to hear that their survival mattered too. Maybe the world needed reminding that the battles we couldn't see were just as worthy of honor as the ones etched into history books. Keanu looked back at the comment that had struck him most. Not all medals are worn around the neck, some are carried inside the heart. He wrote the words down slowly. They would be the seed of something new, something for Walter, something for all the silent heroes still waiting to be seen. Keanu closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair, the beginnings of a plan forming quietly in his heart. Tomorrow, he would visit Walter again. But this time, he wouldn't just listen. He would start building the bridge back to a world that had once left Walter behind. And he would make sure Walter knew his story was not over. It was just beginning. The next afternoon, Keanu sat at a small corner cafe near the town square, sipping a cup of black coffee and sketching more notes into his worn notebook. Every story he had read the night before echoed in his mind. Every survivor, every quiet fighter, every soul who had carried a burden unseen. He wasn't sure exactly what the next step would look like, but he knew the foundation could do more than just share anonymous stories. They could create something tangible, something that told men like Walter that they were seen, valued, and needed. Keanu drafted an idea for a new campaign, Silent Strength. It would honor those who fought battles no one could see, veterans, survivors, families torn by wars fought both overseas and inside their own homes. A way to create space for healing where none had existed before. He would start it with Walter. Keanu smiled quietly to himself, the idea growing more certain. He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Sophia, outlining the beginning of the project. She replied almost instantly, "I love it. Tell me when you're ready. I'll make sure we get the support." Later that evening, Keanu made his way back to Walter's small, weathered home. The porch light was on, casting a faint glow across the cracked steps. Keanu could see Walter's silhouette through the living room window, still sitting in his battered armchair, still clutching the photograph like it was the only thing tethering him to the world. Keanu hesitated at the gate, taking a breath. This wasn't about saving anyone. It was about reminding a good man that he had never been forgotten. Keanu pushed the gate open and walked toward the door, the cool night air swirling around him. As he reached for the doorbell, he thought again of the comment that had stayed with him since the night before. Some metals are carried inside the heart. Walter had been carrying his for decades. It was time the world finally saw it. When the door creaked open and Walter's tired eyes met his, Keanu didn't say anything grand or polished. He simply smiled and said, "Mind if I sit for a while?" Walter nodded. And, just like that, a door cracked open, not just between two men, but between a broken past and the first fragile steps toward healing. Inside that small, worn house, with no cameras, no speeches, and no ceremony, something remarkable began. Not with parades or fanfare, but with the simplest, stubbornest kind of honor there is. Showing up, again and again, until the walls start to fall, until the silence learns how to speak, until a man who thought he was forgotten starts to believe that maybe, just maybe, he never really was. The park bench had become their meeting place. No formal plans, no firm schedules. Just two men, a couple of coffee cups, and the slow turning of seasons above their heads. Some days they spoke, some days they didn't. But Keanu showed up, every single time. Walter didn't talk much at first. He would sit staring at the leaves, sometimes tapping the old photograph against his knee in a restless rhythm. Keanu never pushed. He would simply sit beside him, watching the breeze lift the yellowing leaves into soft spirals across the grass. It took weeks before Walter finally spoke. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the trees. Walter's voice was rough, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. "I was 20 when I first saw a jungle," Walter said, his eyes locked somewhere beyond the horizon. Keanu said nothing. He only listened, the way someone listens to something sacred. Walter told him about the heat, about the way the air stuck to your skin like a second uniform, about the sounds. So loud, so constant, they felt like they pressed into your very bones. He talked about the first time he heard gunfire, for real, how it wasn't like in the movies. No slow mashing heroics, just chaos, smoke, and the sickening realization that you either moved or you didn't come back. Keanu's chest tightened, but he kept his face calm, his posture open. He wasn't there to judge. He was there to witness. Walter talked about the friends he made, about playing cards on their helmets in the mud, about bad coffee brewed over campfires, about the jokes that weren't funny, but were all they had to keep the fear away. Then, slowly, he began to talk about the friends he lost. "Maybe we're just kids," Walter whispered one afternoon, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We all were." Mr. Keanu didn't interrupt, not once. Walter spoke of survivor's guilt, that invisible chain he had carried every day since. About how he could never quite explain to people back home why he flinched at fireworks, why crowded rooms made his hands sweat, why he sometimes went silent for days. "They expect me to come back and be normal," Walter said one rainy day, watching the droplets chase each other down the metal arm of the bench. "But I left normal in that jungle." Keanu sat through the stories like a stone in the river, letting the current wash over him. Some days Walter only managed a few sentences before retreating into silence. Other days, the dam broke and the memories came tumbling out in raw, jagged fragments. He never forced Walter to stay in the pain. If the older man needed to stop mid-sentence and just breathe, Keanu waited with him. If Walter veered off into a different topic, talking about his old dog, about fishing trips with his dad, Keanu followed him there too, knowing that healing wasn't a straight line. Over time, Walter's posture began to change. He sat a little straighter, his eyes held a little more light. And when Keanu laughed gently at one of Walter's dry jokes about army food being worse than anything he'd eaten in civilian life, Walter actually chuckled back. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The next few meetings unfolded like slow ripples across a pond. Walter didn't rush. Keanu didn't expect him to. Trust was something earned through patience, not promises. One crisp afternoon, Walter showed up with something new tucked under his arm. A tattered journal, its corners frayed from years of being shoved into coat pockets and drawers. He held it for a long time without speaking, running his rough fingers along the spine as if unsure whether to reveal its contents. Finally, he handed it to Keanu without a word. Keanu took it carefully, understanding without being told that it wasn't just a book, it was a battlefield all its own. He flipped through the pages slowly. Inside were poems, song lyrics, scribbled letters never sent, fragments of Walter's soul scattered across cheap paper. One entry caught Keanu's eye. It was dated the week Walter had returned from the war. Nobody cheered, nobody understood. I told myself I was lucky, I was alive. But part of me never got off that plane. Keanu closed the journal gently, feeling the gravity of what he held. He looked at Walter, who stared ahead at the trees, his face unreadable. "Thank you for trusting me," Keanu said simply. Walter nodded once, his throat working around the lump of emotion he didn't let escape. Over time, the journal became a bridge between them. Some days Keanu would bring a passage he had marked, and Walter would explain the story behind it. Other days, they sat quietly while Keanu read the poems aloud under his breath, letting Walter's own words breathe in the open air for the first time. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Walter, voice trembling, confessed the thing that haunted him most. "I pushed them away," he said, staring down at his hands. "My wife, my kids. I didn't mean to, I didn't want them to see what was left of me." Keanu's heart cracked open at the confession, raw and without self-pity. "You were trying to protect them," Keanu said gently. "You were surviving the only way you knew how." Walter didn't answer at first, but his shoulders eased slightly, as if someone had finally said the words he hadn't allowed himself to believe. The park became their sanctuary. Sometimes teenagers on skateboards would race past, shouting and laughing. Other times, old couples strolled by, holding hands. Life flowed around them, but inside their small corner, time slowed and softened. Keanu never asked Walter for more than he could give. He simply stayed, and in the staying, something miraculous happened. As Walter began to heal, not through grand gestures, not through speeches or medals, but through small, stubborn acts of showing up, day after day after day. It wasn't about fixing Walter's broken pieces. It was about honoring them, because some wounds aren't meant to disappear. Some are meant to be carried with dignity. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone isn't to erase their scars. It's to see them, and stay anyway. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Walter surprised Keanu by bringing 2 cups of coffee. It was a small thing, paper cups from the gas station down the street. But Keanu understood it for what it really was, a beginning. They sat on their usual bench, sipping quietly, watching the world pass by. Walter's posture wasn't as tense. His voice, when he spoke, was steadier. "You know," Walter said, gazing into the distance, "people think coming home is the easy part." Keanu listened. "It's not." Walter paused. "It's like you get frozen over there, and when you land back here, everyone else kept moving. You're still carrying sand and smoke inside you, but nobody sees it. They just see a man who's stuck." Keanu nodded slowly. "Maybe they didn't know how to ask." Walter gave a rough chuckle. "Maybe I didn't know how to answer." A silence fell between them. But it wasn't heavy anymore. It was the kind of silence that felt like understanding. Walter pulled the battered photo from his jacket again, held it like an anchor. "My daughter?" he said quietly. "Her name's Sarah. She used to sit on my lap when she was little. Played with my dog tags, thought they were magic." He smiled at the memory, but his eyes stayed sad. "I missed birthdays, graduations, all because I didn't know how to sit in a room without feeling like I was still out there." Keanu didn't offer easy reassurances. He didn't tell Walter he could just pick up the pieces. He knew it wasn't that simple. Instead, he said, "You didn't leave her. The war took you longer to come home from." Walter blinked rapidly. He looked away. A few minutes later, he cleared his throat and said, "I don't even know what I'd say to her now, after everything." Keanu placed his coffee cup down gently. "Maybe you don't have to say much," Keanu said. "Maybe it's just about being willing to try." Walter said nothing, but he didn't shut down either. That was the difference now. Each conversation, each shared silence was a stitch pulling Walter's heart back together, thread by invisible thread. Keanu knew the journey ahead would not be fast or easy, but he also knew that Walter wasn't alone anymore. And sometimes survival was stitched together not with grand acts of heroism, but with one human heart daring to sit quietly beside another. By the time the street lights flickered on, Walter turned to Keanu and said something he hadn't said in years. "Thanks for coming back." Keanu smiled, feeling the depth of those words. "I never left," he said softly. And for the first time in a long time, Walter believed him. Walter sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the brittle photo cradled in his hands. Keanu sat beside him without saying a word, the cool morning air threading between them like a silent witness. "I wasn't a bad man," Walter said eventually, voice rough and low, "just a broken one." Keanu didn't interrupt. Walter's thumb ran along the edge of the photo, worn from years of handling. "After the war, I didn't know how to be in a room without seeing things that weren't there. I didn't know how to hear someone laugh without feeling guilty." Keanu shifted slightly, leaning closer, making sure Walter knew he was truly being heard. "My daughter," Walter continued, his throat tightening. "Her name's Sarah. She used to bring me drawings. Crayons, scribbles, you know? I'd put them on the fridge. I wanted to be happy for her, I really did." And he swallowed hard. But inside I was still buried somewhere else. Someplace dusty and hot and full of silence. Keanu stayed quiet, giving Walter the space to navigate the heavy terrain of memory. "I never raised a hand to her," Walter said fiercely, as if needing that on the record. "I never yelled, never drank, but I wasn't there, not really, not the way a father's supposed to be." The bench creaked as he shifted, turning the photo over, revealing faint handwriting on the back. "Daddy's my hero." The words seemed to mock him now. "There were birthdays I forgot to show up for," Walter said. "Recitals I promised to attend but couldn't walk into because crowds made my skin crawl." Keanu finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You were carrying too much alone." Walter gave a bitter smile. "Yeah, and in the end, carrying it alone cost me everything." He looked out at the empty park, as if expecting echoes of the life he had missed to come drifting back through the trees. "Sarah stopped asking me to come to things. Then she stopped calling altogether. Then the boys did too." Keanu's chest tightened at the quiet finality in Walter's voice. "And my wife, she stayed longer than she should have, God bless her. But even she couldn't fight a ghost forever." Walter blinked rapidly, trying to clear the emotion from his weathered face. "It was easier for them to forget me," he said. "Easier than watching me crumble piece by piece." For a while they just sat there, two men bound by different kinds of scars. Keanu wanted to tell him that forgetting wasn't the same as not loving, that sometimes distance was the only armor people had against heartbreak. But he knew Walter needed more than comforting words. He needed someone willing to sit in the brokenness with him without rushing to patch it over. Finally, Keanu asked softly, "Do you want to find her?" Walter looked at him, eyes bloodshot and ancient. "I don't even know if she'd want to find me," he whispered. Keanu placed a hand gently on Walter's shoulder, grounding him. "Sometimes," Keanu said, "all it takes is showing her that you're still here, that you never stopped being her father, even when you didn't know how." Walter closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something new in his gaze. Not hope, exactly, but maybe the battered beginning of it. The next Tuesday, Keanu met Walter again at the park bench. This time, Walter looked a little different. His shoulders were still heavy with years of pain, but there was a tiny crease of purpose in his posture, like he was trying to stand a little taller. Keanu carried 2 coffees, handing one over without a word. Walter accepted it with a small nod of thanks. For a while, they sat quietly, the sounds of birds and distant traffic filling the spaces between them. Finally, Keanu broke the silence. "You said Sarah used to draw for you." Walter gave a faint smile, the kind that hurt more than it healed. "Yeah, little things, rainbows, dogs with lopsided legs, stick figures with superhero capes." Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook. He placed it gently on the bench between them. "If you ever wanted," Keanu said carefully, "you could write her something. No pressure, just your story, in your own words." Walter stared at the notebook like it was a landmine. "I wouldn't even know where to start," he muttered. Keanu leaned back against the bench, looking up at the sky. "Start with a thank you. Thank her for the pictures. Thank her for loving you when you didn't know how to stay." Walter didn't answer. His fingers just brushed the edge of the notebook, like he wasn't sure he deserved to touch it. "You don't have to fix everything in one letter," Keanu added softly. "Just let her hear your heart." Walter's hands trembled slightly as he picked up the notebook, thumbing through the blank pages. They were so empty, so full of all the things he had never said. Keanu didn't rush him. They sat there until the sun began to dip behind the town's low rooftops, shadows stretching long and thin across the park. Finally, Walter tucked the notebook inside his worn coat. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe. I'll try." Keanu smiled. Not a big smile, just enough to say, "I believe you can." The next time they met, Walter had scribbled something on the first page. It wasn't much, just a few lines, messy and uncertain. "Sarah, I never stopped being your father. I just didn't know how to be whole. I'm sorry I let you think you were forgotten. You were never forgotten. You were the light I thought I'd." He handed the notebook to Keanu without meeting his eyes. "Doesn't sound like much," Walter said, almost ashamed. Keanu read the words carefully. Then he looked at Walter and shook his head. "It's everything," Keanu said. Walter gave a rough, embarrassed shrug. "She probably won't even read it." Keanu's voice was steady. "Maybe. Maybe not. But you showed up. That matters more than you know." Walter stared out across the park, breathing in deeply, the autumn air sharp in his lungs. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying everything alone. Maybe he couldn't erase the past. But maybe, just maybe, he could still write something new. A few days later, Keanu met with Sophia at the Foundation's office. He showed her Walter's letter, careful to explain that Walter hadn't asked for any miracles. He just wanted Sarah to know she was still in his heart. Sophia read it, blinking back emotion. She nodded. "We'll find her." It didn't take long. Sarah Briggs was living 2 towns over, working as a school counselor. She had a small apartment, a son in middle school, and, according to public records, had kept her maiden name. Sophia drafted a gentle message. No pressure, no big reveal, just a quiet note explaining that someone from her past had written her a letter, and it was waiting if she wanted to read it. The Foundation mailed it. Then they waited. For days, Walter said nothing about it. Maybe he was protecting himself from hope. Maybe he thought she wouldn't answer. But on a rainy Thursday afternoon, as Keanu sat beside him in the park, Walter's old flip phone buzzed. He froze. Keanu watched him with careful patience. Walter fumbled the phone open. A text message blinked up from the small screen. "I'd like to hear your story. Sarah." Walter's breath hitched. His hands trembled so badly that Keanu gently took the coffee from his lap before he spilled it. He sat there, staring at the message like it was written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. Keanu broke the silence. "You don't have to rush. Just answer her when you're ready." Walter nodded slowly. His voice cracked when he whispered, "I thought I lost her." "You didn't," Keanu said. "You just got lost for a while. And now you get to find your way back." That evening, Walter spent an hour crafting a response. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real. "Thank you for giving me the chance. I have missed you every day." He hit send, and for the first time in a very, very long time, Walter Briggs allowed himself to hope. The following week, Sarah agreed to meet. It would not be a grand reunion, no cameras, no crowds, just a coffee shop, neutral ground, two people carrying more baggage than words. Walter showed up early, nervously adjusting the collar of his worn jacket. Keanu sat in the car across the street, waiting, watching. Sarah entered, cautious but not cold. She had her mother's eyes, Walter thought, and something in her posture that spoke of walls built high and thick. But she came. Walter stood awkwardly, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. He didn't know if he should reach out or if that would scare her away. Sarah broke the silence. "You look older," she said, with a half smile, half tear in her voice. Walter gave a rough chuckle. "I earned every line." She hesitated, then she pulled out a chair and sat. For the next hour, they didn't talk about the war. They didn't talk about the years lost. They talked about little things: music, her job, her son. Walter listened, drinking in every word like a man starving. When it was time to leave, Sarah stood and slung her bag over her shoulder. She didn't say goodbye. She said, "See you next week?" Walter's voice cracked. "I'd like that." As she disappeared out the door, Walter sat back down at the table, hands trembling, heart hammering. He had been forgotten once, but today, he had been remembered. And maybe that was enough. The next step wasn't easy. Keanu sat with Walter at a quiet diner one afternoon, a stack of brochures between them. They were simple, nothing flashy, small pamphlets from a nearby VA center about trauma recovery programs, peer support groups, art therapy, and music therapy sessions, designed for veterans carrying invisible scars. Walter pushed the papers aside, shaking his head. "Therapy's not for soldiers," he muttered, voice gravelly with stubbornness and something deeper. "Fear." Keanu didn't argue. He just let the words settle. After a long moment, he leaned forward, elbows resting on the worn table. "Survival isn't weakness, Walter," he said, his voice low and steady. "It's courage, and courage doesn't mean fighting alone." Walter looked out the window, his jaw clenching. He tapped the side of his coffee cup with a trembling finger. Outside, the town rolled by, indifferent. Families rushing past, school buses, people going about their lives. Lives that once would have included him. "You don't know what it's like," Walter said after a while. Keanu nodded. "You're right. I don't. But I do know what it's like to carry something heavy for so long, you forget you can put it down." Walter didn't respond. Keanu let silence work its magic. By the end of the meal, Walter hadn't committed to anything. But he took the top brochure with him, the one about the peer group for veterans. Small steps, Keanu reminded himself. Always small steps. The following Tuesday, Keanu drove Walter to the VA center under the guise of grabbing lunch together afterward. Walter grumbled the whole ride there, but he didn't ask Keanu to turn around. That alone was a victory. Inside, The VA center wasn't the sterile, cold place Walter had feared. The walls were painted with murals made by veterans themselves, landscapes, flags, scenes from childhood memories. A few men and women sat in the waiting area, talking quietly, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs. Walter hesitated in the doorway. Keanu touched his shoulder lightly. "You don't have to say anything, just listen." Walter nodded stiffly and took a seat in the circle. The group leader, a retired Navy medic named James, welcomed him with a nod but no pressure. They didn't force introductions. They didn't demand stories. They let silence be an acceptable language. One man spoke about nightmares, another about guilt over surviving when others didn't. Asher said. Walter sat there, hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. He didn't speak that day, but he stayed. When they left, Walter said nothing for a long time. Keanu didn't push. He drove him to a diner afterward like he promised, ordered 2 coffees, and talked about baseball instead. Walter listened, nodded occasionally, and halfway through the conversation, cracked the faintest smile. The next week, Walter asked if they could go back. This time, when the circle opened, Walter spoke. His voice was quiet, ragged. He didn't tell them everything. Just a small piece. "I never wanted medals," he said, eyes fixed on the floor. "I just wanted to come home and not feel like a ghost." The group didn't clap. They didn't drown him in sympathy. They just listened. And for the first time in decades, Walter Briggs was seen. The weeks that followed were slow but steady. Walter began to arrive at the sessions before Keanu did. Sometimes he'd bring a battered composition notebook, scribbling thoughts between meetings. Sophia had gently suggested he try journaling. At first, he had scoffed, calling it writing for people who have too much time. But one day, sitting alone on his porch, Walter picked up a pen. Inside that notebook, small truths began to spill out. He wrote about the brothers he lost, about the fear he never voiced, about the long, bitter silence between him and his children. He wrote about Sarah, the little girl who once fell asleep clutching his dog tags, and the teenager he pushed away without ever meaning to. And slowly, a different kind of bravery took root. At the VA center, Walter shared small pieces during group talks. How some mornings felt like waking up underwater. How loud noises still set his heart racing. How sometimes he went entire days without speaking a word out loud. The others understood. They nodded, not with pity, but with solidarity. Keanu noticed the change too. Walter stood a little straighter. His eyes met people's more often. He even began helping a younger veteran who struggled with anger, pulling him aside after meetings, speaking in low, rough tones that carried the weight of lived experience. "Hell reminds me of me," Walter admitted to Keanu one evening as they sat outside the center, watching the sun set over the hills. "All fire and nowhere to put it." Keanu smiled. "Maybe now you can help him find a place." Walter snorted softly. "You and your therapy talk." But he didn't say no. In the background, Sophia quietly connected the threads needed to get Walter's home repaired. The roof had leaked for years. Volunteers patched it up, rebuilt a crumbling porch, cleaned the gutters clogged with decades of fallen leaves. Walter didn't ask for it. He didn't need to. When he saw the work being done, he stood in the yard for a long time, hands in his jacket pockets, jaw working back and forth. Then he simply nodded once. A small gesture of gratitude, too deep for words. And something else happened. Walter started receiving letters. The Foundation's anonymous story posts had caught attention. Other veterans, strangers from across the country, sent postcards. Some wrote a few words, some sent photographs of their own time in service. Some simply said, "You're not forgotten." Walter read each one slowly, carefully, as if they were delicate artifacts. He pinned them to a corkboard Sophia helped him set up in the living room. The house, once a place of silence and dust, began to hum with the quiet noise of life again. One evening, Keanu found Walter sitting at the kitchen table, repairing an old American flag that had been stuffed in the back of his closet. "You're sewing now too?" Keanu joked gently. Walter shrugged. "Figured if I'm gonna hang it up again, better do it right." The flag went up the next day, flapping stubbornly in the breeze. It wasn't about patriotism alone. It was about belonging. But the biggest change came the day Walter agreed to record a message. Sophia had suggested it, gently, without pressure. A short video, just him talking. Not about war stories, but about survival, about rebuilding. At first, Walter refused. The idea of cameras made his skin crawl. But Keanu sat with him one evening, no agenda, just a conversation. "You don't have to tell the whole world," Keanu said. "Maybe you just tell one person. Maybe you tell yourself." That night, Walter stayed up, staring at the blank screen of his old television, thinking about the years he spent hiding from the world, about the daughter he left behind, about the words he never said. The next afternoon, he asked Sophia to bring a small camera. No lights, no microphone boom, just the living room, the faded armchair, and the quiet. Walter cleared his throat once, then twice. His hands trembled a little as he clutched a folded photo of his unit. And he spoke. He spoke of being 18 and terrified, of losing brothers he called family, of coming home and not recognizing anything, not his town, not his own reflection. He spoke of the anger, the silence, the loneliness that hardened into armor. And he spoke of hope. Hope that it wasn't too late to be a father again. Hope that somewhere, forgiveness still had a seat at the table. When the video finished, Walter sat back and closed his eyes. No big speeches, no applause, just the heavy, aching relief of finally being seen. Sophia uploaded the clip privately to the Foundation's online page, where small stories of survival were shared among families and supporters. She didn't tag Walter's full name, just "A Soldier's Second Chance." Keanu watched as comments trickled in. Words of encouragement. Messages from other veterans who saw their own pain mirrored in Walter's voice. And then, something unexpected happened. Late one night, as Keanu checked the Foundation's inbox, a message arrived. The sender's name was Walter Briggs. It was simple, barely 3 lines. "I think that's my father. I thought he forgot us. I didn't know he was hurting too." Keanu sat back, heart pounding. Walter's bridge wasn't complete, but the first board had been laid. Keanu sat at his small desk, the glow of the Foundation's webpage lighting up the room. Tonight, he decided to post something simple. No big announcements, no curated stories. Just a single question. If you could say one thing to someone you lost touch with, what would it be? He hit post and leaned back, not knowing what to expect. Within minutes, the replies started coming. Some were raw, full of broken pieces that had never found their way back home. "I'm sorry I didn't know how to help you. I never stopped loving you, even when I stayed silent." Others were hopeful, tentative hands reaching across years. "If you're out there, know I'm still waiting. I forgive you. I hope you forgive me too." Keanu read them slowly, one by one, feeling the heavy ache and beauty stitched into each word. It didn't matter where people came from. Different cities, different wars, different reasons for silence. The stories all carried the same heartbeat, the ache of separation and the stubborn hope for reunion. One comment in particular stayed with him. A woman wrote, "Sometimes we wait too long to say what matters. Sometimes we think the door is closed, but it's never too late to call them back home." Keanu read it twice, then a third time. It captured exactly what Walter was walking through, exactly what Sarah was reaching toward. He clicked to save the comment. Not to share it publicly, but to keep it close, a reminder that the work they were doing, quiet, unseen, was opening doors that had been closed for far too long. The next morning, Keanu printed the woman's comment on a small card. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket, before heading out to meet Walter. At the park, Walter was already sitting on their usual bench, the same battered photograph in his hands. His posture was still guarded, but there was a new flicker in his eyes, a wary kind of hope. Keanu didn't push. He sat down quietly beside him, letting the silence breathe. After a few minutes, Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out the card. He didn't explain it, just handed it over. Walter hesitated, then unfolded it with rough fingers. He read the words slowly. Sometimes we wait too long to say what matters. Sometimes we think the door is closed, but it's never too late to call them back home. Walter's hand tightened slightly around the card. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then he whispered, "You think she'd even want to hear from me?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He let Walter sit with the question, let him feel the gravity of it. Finally, Keanu said, "I think sometimes people are waiting too, Walter. Waiting for a reason to believe it's safe to try again." Walter looked down at the card, then back at the faded photo of his old unit. A long breath escaped him. "I don't know how to start," he admitted. "You already did," Keanu said gently, "by staying." Walter stared at the horizon, the edges of the town visible beyond the trees, and for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine that maybe the distance between him and his family wasn't as permanent as he thought. Maybe some doors could open again, even after all this time. Maybe it wasn't too late. Walter folded the card slowly, almost reverently, and slid it into his jacket pocket. The way he handled it, you would have thought it was something far more fragile, like an old letter from a loved one, or a medal earned through fire. Keanu stayed silent beside him. He knew better than to rush these moments. Across the forum, the comments kept pouring in. Keanu had checked them that morning. Some were short, raw admissions. "I should have called my dad when I had the chance." Others were more hopeful. "After 5 years, my sister and I finally talked again." There was a rhythm to the stories: regret, longing, courage, healing. Walter shifted slightly on the bench, his voice a whisper. "What would I even say?" Keanu thought about it for a moment before answering. "Maybe you don't need the perfect words," he said. "Maybe you just need the truth." Walter gave a soft, broken laugh. "The truth hurts." "Sometimes it does," Keanu agreed. "But sometimes it sets something free." Walter nodded slowly, his fingers drumming lightly against the photograph in his lap. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the park, a quiet decision seemed to settle over him. No announcements, no promises, just a small, stubborn flicker of willingness. For men like Walter, men forged in battle, hardened by survival, that willingness was everything. Later that evening, Keanu saw a new anonymous comment posted under the Foundation's forum thread. It read simply, "Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, I miss you. I never stopped. I just didn't know how to say it." Keanu smiled softly at the screen. Walter had made his first step, not through grand speeches, not through medals or ceremonies, but through a few broken, honest words. And sometimes that's all it takes. The news segment was brief. It didn't lead the evening broadcast, tucked somewhere between a local bake sale fundraiser and weather updates. But for Sarah Briggs, it felt like time froze the moment the screen flickered and her father's face appeared. She almost didn't recognize him at first. The Walter she remembered was distant, emotionally unreachable, a shadow of a man more than a presence. Growing up, Sarah had waited for birthdays, school plays, graduations, hoping he would somehow show up, not just in body, but in heart. He rarely did. Now, on the screen, she saw a different version of him. An older man, yes, lined with age, wear, and regret, but also a man trying to tell his story for the first time. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke into the microphone, yet his voice carried a stubborn steadiness. He didn't talk about war tactics or victories. Instead, he spoke about silence, about the battles that never ended when the uniforms came off, about how easy it was to get lost inside yourself and how much harder it was to find your way back. Sarah stared, hardly breathing, as he clutched a worn photograph to his chest. His voice cracked once when he mentioned the family I didn't know how to stay for. Tears blurred her vision before the clip ended. For years, she had painted him as careless, absent, maybe even undeserving. She had built thick walls around herself to survive the disappointment. But now she realized she had never really understood the war he was fighting inside. The anchor moved on to the next story, but Sarah remained frozen on the couch, remote slipping from her fingers onto the carpet. For the first time in years, something inside her shifted. Not all at once, not a tidal wave of forgiveness, more like the first crack in a dam built too high for too long. Still, the idea of reaching out terrified her. What if he didn't want her anymore? What if the walls he had built were stronger than the ones she had hidden behind? She sat there for nearly an hour, staring at the frozen image of the paused news clip on her TV. Her father, worn and weathered, sitting quietly with a medal in his lap he never asked for. Eventually, her hands moved almost of their own accord. She found the name of the foundation mentioned in the segment, Keanu Reeves Foundation for Veterans and Survivors of Trauma. There was a simple contact form on their website. No fanfare, no promises. Sarah's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long time. Then, slowly, she began to type. "My name is Sarah Briggs. I think you helped my father. I'd like to know if it's too late to say hello." She hesitated before pressing send, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. Then, breath held. She clicked the button, and somewhere in that small act, Sarah knew something had shifted. Maybe forgiveness didn't come with grand speeches. Maybe it started with 3 simple words. "Hello, Dad." The foundation's office was quiet when Sophia received the message. She recognized the name immediately, Sarah Briggs. Without hesitating, she forwarded it to Keanu, her note simple, "She's reaching out." Keanu sat back for a long moment, staring at the message. 1,000 emotions flickered across his face. Hope, fear, a kind of deep respect for the courage it took to even write those few words. He didn't reply to Sarah directly. Instead, he picked up the phone and called Walter. When Walter answered, his voice was cautious. Keanu didn't rush him. Instead, he asked a simple question. "Would you be willing to meet someone who never forgot you?" Silence stretched on the line. Then, almost too soft to hear, Walter said, "Is it her?" Keanu smiled gently into the receiver. "It's her." Baldo's voice cracked. "I don't know if I can do it right." "You don't have to," Keanu said. "You just have to be there." They set a time. Neutral ground, a coffee shop close to the park where Walter liked to sit. No media, no crowds. Just a quiet place where time could begin again, if both hearts allowed it. When the day came, Keanu arrived first, sitting off to the side, watching the door. Walter shuffled in a few minutes later, his coat too big for his frame, his steps hesitant. He clutched the same battered photo he had carried all those years. And then Sarah walked in. For a moment, none of them moved. Walter's hand tightened on the photograph, knuckles white. Sarah looked smaller than Keanu had expected. Tougher around the eyes, but trembling around the edges, like someone who had been carrying too much for too long. Walter rose slowly from his chair, unsure, almost childlike in his vulnerability. Sarah didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, drinking in the lines on his face, the years they had lost. Finally, her voice cracked out, small and broken, but real. "You still have the picture," she whispered. Weston nodded. His voice broke. "You're still my daughter." Tears filled Sarah's eyes. She didn't run to him. She didn't throw her arms around him like in some perfect movie moment. Instead, she sat down across from him, folded her hands. waited. Walter did the same. Two broken people, still figuring out if their pieces could fit back together. Keanu stood silently and walked outside, giving them the space they needed. He watched from the window as, slowly, painfully, Walter reached across the table and slid the photograph towards Sarah. An invitation. Sarah looked at him, then at him, and nodded. A beginning. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And sometimes that was enough. The hours passed slowly. No rushing, no expectation of grand speeches. Just halting conversation, cups of coffee cooling untouched between them. They talked about small things at first. Weather, work, books Sarah liked, neighborhoods Walter barely remembered. And then, as the light outside shifted into gold, the deeper things emerged. While they apologized, not dramatically, not in some sweeping confession, but in the simplest way a wounded man could. "I wasn't the father you deserved," he said, staring at the table. "I let the war stay with me too long." Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek. "I didn't understand back then," she whispered. "Nobody explained it, you just disappeared." Walter looked up, and for the first time, the full weight of his regret was visible in his eyes. "I never stopped loving you," he said, "even when I couldn't show it." Sarah nodded, tears falling freely now. "I know that, now." Outside, Keanu leaned quietly against the wall, hands in his jacket pockets, giving them the moment that had taken decades to arrive. He knew better than to interfere. Some reunions needed space to bloom. Inside the cafe, something extraordinary happened, small but powerful. Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a worn card. It was a birthday card, yellowed with age, bent at the corners. She slid it across the table to Walter. "I kept this," she said softly. "You sent it when I turned 12. It just said, 'I love you, always.' I didn't believe it back then, but I kept it anyway." Walter picked up the card with trembling hands, reading the simple, childlike scrawl inside. His breath hitched. His shoulders shook. But he didn't cry loudly. He just bowed his head over the card like a prayer. In that moment, nothing needed fixing. Nothing needed perfect words. Two people, separated by war and wounds and silence, found their way back through something stronger than pain. Forgiveness. When Keanu finally re-entered the cafe to check on them, he found Walter and Sarah sitting shoulder to shoulder, still not speaking much, but this time, there was no distance between them. Walter clutched the photo of his old unit in one hand. Sarah clutched his sleeve with the other. The past hadn't vanished. The years lost could never fully be reclaimed. But something new had begun. Something stitched together not by forgetting, but by choosing to love anyway. And as Keanu quietly paid the bill and slipped out again, he realized that sometimes the biggest miracles don't come in grand gestures. Sometimes they arrive in the silence between two broken hearts, finally finding the courage to sit together again. Walter sat on his usual bench under the broad oak tree, the late afternoon sun draping the park in a soft, golden haze. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his gaze distant. He didn't notice Keanu approach until the familiar shadow stretched across the concrete at his feet. Keanu said nothing at first. He just sat beside him, handing over a simple envelope. No markings, no stamps. Just Walter's name written in careful, uncertain handwriting across the front. Walter hesitated. He hadn't received a personal letter in years. Bills, notices, government mail. That was all that ever found him anymore. This was different. His fingers, worn and calloused, traced the edges of the envelope, as if trying to absorb whatever was inside without having to open it. Keanu placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "It's from Sarah," he said quietly. Walter froze. For a long, aching moment, he simply stared at the envelope. The wind stirred around them, carrying the distant laughter of children playing nearby, the soft rustle of the leaves. Life kept moving, even as Walter's world narrowed to the thin piece of paper in his lap. Slowly, carefully, he opened it. Inside was a letter. Not long, not polished, but every word pressed heavily against his heart. She had written, "Dear Dad, I don't really know where to start. There's so much I wish you had told me. There's so much I needed to hear from you. I was angry for a long time. I still am sometimes. I didn't understand why you left even when you stayed in the same town. But then I saw you on the news. I heard your voice for the first time in years, and I realized you didn't leave because you stopped loving us. You left because you didn't know how to come back. I'm scared to open this door. I don't know if you are too, but if you still want to talk, I'm here. Sarah." Walter read the letter twice, then 3 times. Each time, the words hit a little deeper. Not accusations, not demands, just raw, vulnerable truth. He folded the letter neatly, holding it between his palms like a fragile bird. Keanu sat beside him in silence, letting him process. He understood there was nothing he could say that mattered more than giving Walter the space to feel it. Finally, Walter spoke, his voice rough as gravel. "She didn't have to write," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Keanu smiled gently. "But she did." Walter blinked hard against the sting in his eyes. For years he had believed the damage was permanent, that silence was the only thing left between him and his children, that maybe he deserved to be forgotten. But this letter, this small, trembling offer, changed everything. He tucked it carefully into his breast pocket, patting it once like a man ensuring something precious was safe. "Tell her," Walter said quietly. "Tell her I still want to talk. I always wanted to talk. I just didn't know if I was allowed anymore." Keanu didn't need to write that message down. It was clear, it was real. It was more than enough. As they sat there under the oak tree, the setting sun throwing long shadows across the park, Walter looked older somehow, but also lighter, as if just being seen, being heard, had lifted some invisible weight from his shoulders. He pulled out a battered notepad from his jacket, something he carried for years but rarely used, and, with a shaking hand, began to write a letter of his own. A letter back to the daughter he thought he had lost. A letter that would begin a new chapter neither of them had dared to hope for. Walter's hand hovered over the paper for a long moment before the pen finally touched down. His writing was uneven, his fingers stiff from years of disuse, but every word he etched into the page came straight from the center of a battered heart that had never stopped caring. "Dear Sarah, I don't deserve this chance, but I'm grateful for it more than I can say. There are a million things I should have said to you years ago. I don't even know where to begin. The truth is, when I came back from the war, I wasn't the man who left. I didn't know how to explain that. I didn't know how to be your dad when I couldn't even look at myself without shame. I hid, not because I didn't love you, but because I loved you so much I didn't want you to see how broken I was. I see now that silence hurt you worse than anything I could have said. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry for the birthdays missed, the school plays I didn't attend, the nights you needed your father and only found a closed door. I want you to know, none of it was your fault. None of it was because you weren't enough. You were always enough. If you're willing, I would love to see you. No expectations, no apologies demanded, just a chance to listen to you now the way I should have back then." When he finished writing, Walter sat back, breathing heavily. The letter trembled in his hand. Keanu gently reached for it, giving Walter a small, reassuring nod. "I'll make sure she gets it," he said. Walter wiped at his eyes roughly, embarrassed by the emotion leaking out in ways he couldn't control anymore. "She might not come," Walter said, voice thick, "and I wouldn't blame her." Keanu shook his head. "Maybe not right away, maybe not perfectly. But you opened the door, Walter. That's more than most people ever dared to do." Walter stared out at the park, his jaw tightening. The ache of years lost would never fully vanish, but there was something new growing in the cracks now, something that looked a little bit like hope. He glanced down at his hands. They were not the hands of a young man anymore. They were scarred, lined, and calloused from battles both seen and unseen. But they were still hands that could build bridges, even after all this time. "Thank you," Walter said after a long pause. Keanu smiled warmly. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "You just keep going. That's more than enough." Walter tucked the letter carefully into a new envelope, his handwriting shaky but determined on the front. Sarah Briggs. He handed it over with both hands, like an offering, like a prayer. As Keanu stood to leave, Walter called after him, softly. Tell her I never stopped being her dad. I just forgot how to show it." Keanu turned, nodding once, his throat too tight to answer. And with that, the smallest crack of light began to split open the long night Walter had been trapped in. It wasn't everything, but it was a beginning. Keanu held the envelope carefully as he made his way across town, feeling the weight of it in his pocket. This wasn't just a letter. It was decades of silence, shame, regret, and love stitched into every line. And now it was traveling toward the girl who had once waited at windows and doorways for a father who didn't know how to come home. Sarah was waiting at a quiet cafe, tucked into a corner booth where the afternoon light barely reached. She looked nervous, fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve as Keanu approached. Without a word, Keanu slid the envelope across the table. Sarah stared at it for a long moment. Her hands hovered above it like she was afraid to touch it, afraid that it might vanish if she reached out. Finally, she picked it up, broke the seal, and began to read. At first, her face remained neutral, eyes scanning each line, but then, little by little, cracks appeared. Her brow furrowed, her lips trembled. By the time she reached the last paragraph, silent tears were slipping down her cheeks. She pressed the letter to her chest, hugging it like it was something alive, something lost and found again. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Keanu gave her a moment, then said softly, "He never stopped loving you. He just didn't know how to say it." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes. "I want to see him," she whispered. "I don't know if I can forgive everything yet, but I want to try." Keanu smiled gently, feeling a profound swell of something larger than simple happiness. This was redemption. This was the real victory Walter had been waiting for all along. "I think he's been waiting for that longer than you know," Keanu said. And somewhere, in the heart of two broken timelines, a bridge had begun to rebuild, one letter, one heartbeat at a time. Walter sat on the edge of his worn couch, staring at the slip of paper in his trembling hand. On it, Sarah's number was written in neat, careful digits, like it had been pressed there with a hope too fragile to say out loud. Keanu stood a few feet away, giving Walter the space he needed, his presence silent but steady. Walter stared at the paper a few moments longer, then picked up the phone. His fingers hovered above the keypad, frozen. For a moment it seemed like he might put it down again. But then, with a long, steadying breath, Walter punched in the numbers. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Walter's heart pounded harder with each passing second. Maybe she wouldn't answer. Maybe it was better if she didn't. Then there was a click, and Sarah's voice, soft but real, came through the line. "Hello?" Walter's throat locked. The words he had practiced over and over in his head evaporated. For a moment he could only breathe, shaky and broken, into the phone. "Sarah?" he finally rasped. There was a pause. He could hear her breathe in, small and sharp, like the sound of someone stepping into cold water. "Hi, Dad," she said quietly. The words hit him like a physical blow. Dad. She had called him Dad. Walter closed his eyes, feeling tears sting. I wasn't sure you'd want to hear from me," he said, voice cracking with every syllable. Another long pause stretched between them, heavy but not empty. I wasn't sure either, Sarah admitted. Walter swallowed, gripping the phone tighter, feeling the tremor in his hands. I don't expect anything, he said hoarsely. I just wanted to hear your voice. Sarah was silent again, but this time it didn't feel like rejection. It felt like searching for something to hold on to, something that hadn't been broken by years of silence. I'm glad you called, she said finally. Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, sagging back against the couch like the weight of decades had suddenly lifted, just an inch. They didn't talk about the past, not directly. Neither one was ready to peel back the scabs that had formed over old wounds. Instead, they spoke in small, uncertain steps, about safe things, shallow things, the weather, how the leaves were changing, how Sarah's daughter had just started piano lessons. Walter listened, soaking in every detail, every word, like they were pieces of a life he thought he had lost forever. At one point, Sarah hesitated, then said, Maybe we could meet sometime. Walter's voice broke again. I'd like that, more than anything. They didn't make plans that day. It was too soon, and both of them knew it. But the bridge had been built, rough and wobbly though it was, and for now, it was enough. After they hung up, Walter sat there for a long time, the silent phone pressed against his heart. Keanu, who had waited quietly across the room, walked over and sat beside him without a word. Walter didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The small, shaky smile on his face said it all. The next few days passed in a blur for Walter. Every time the phone rang, his heart leapt in his chest. Every time it didn't, he reminded himself to be patient. Healing took time. Rebuilding trust after years of silence wasn't something that could happen with just one call. Keanu stopped by often, never pressing, just being there. Sometimes they played chess in the park. Sometimes they simply watched the birds pick at breadcrumbs scattered across the sidewalk. Walter began to notice small things he hadn't before, the way the sun caught the trees, the way strangers smiled at one another. Life felt just a little less heavy. One chilly afternoon, Walter received a text message. Simple, but enough to make his hands tremble all over again. Thinking about you today. Hope you're okay. Sarah. Walter stared at it for a long time. No one had said those words to him in years. Carefully, he typed back. I'm okay, better now, thank you. He hit send before he could lose the courage. That evening, Walter called Keanu, voice thick with emotion. She texted me, he said. She thought about me. Keanu smiled through the phone. Of course she did, Walter. You were never as forgotten as you thought. It was a strange thing, realizing that even when you feel lost, pieces of you still live in someone else's heart. The next call with Sarah was easier. They laughed a little, joked awkwardly about how bad Walter's cooking still was. She told him about her kids, Walter's grandkids, and he listened like a man starving for every detail. They still didn't talk much about the missing years. Walter knew he owed her an apology, deeper than words, but he sensed that it wasn't time yet. First, he needed to show her, not just tell her, that he was different now, that he was still trying. In one of their calls, Sarah said softly, I used to wonder if you even thought about us. Walter pressed the phone tighter against his ear. Every day, he said, voice breaking. Every single day. I just didn't know how to find my way back. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then whispered, Maybe we can find it together. Tears streamed down Walter's face. He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'd like that, he said. I'd like that very much. After they hung up, Walter sat for a long time in the fading light, staring at the battered photo he still carried. The faces in it looked so young, so hopeful. Somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that he was too broken to deserve forgiveness. But maybe, just maybe, broken things could still heal. Not with grand gestures or perfect words, but with simple, stubborn acts of reaching out, again and again, until the distance didn't feel so impossible anymore. Walter wiped his eyes, tucked the photo back into his coat, and stood up. Tomorrow was another day. Another chance to build something new. Dare and shock. And for the first time in years, he was ready to try. The first thing Keanu noticed when he visited Walter's house was the way it sagged, as if the very bones of the place were tired. Paint peeled from the edges of the doorway, a cracked window rattled weakly against the wind. The front yard was mostly dirt, with a few stubborn weeds clinging to the earth. Walter shuffled behind him, embarrassed but resigned. "It's not much," he muttered. "Never thought there was a point in fixing it up. Nobody coming around to see it anyway." Keanu didn't say much. He just nodded, stepping carefully over a loose floorboard as they entered the small living room. Dust danced in the slants of afternoon light. The furniture was sparse and worn, a reflection of the man who lived there. The next morning, Keanu made a few quiet phone calls. Sophia helped spread the word. No fanfare, no big announcements, just a few messages to the local community boards, a few quiet conversations at the Veterans Center. By the following Saturday, people started to arrive. An old pickup truck rolled up with a load of donated paint cans. A group of high school students showed up with rakes and garbage bags. Two younger veterans, hearing Walter's story through Keanu's foundation, arrived with toolboxes slung over their shoulders and determined looks in their eyes. Walter stood on the porch, stunned as the volunteers gathered. Keanu walked up beside him, holding a paintbrush. "Hope you don't mind," he said casually. "Looks like they thought this place deserved a second chance." Walter's throat tightened. He didn't trust his voice enough to speak, so he just nodded and picked up the paintbrush. They started with the outside, scraping away the peeling paint to reveal the weathered wood beneath. The rhythm of sanding, brushing, and hammering filled the air, blending with the occasional burst of laughter and conversation. Slowly, the tired house began to come back to life. The cracked window was replaced with a donated pane, and a fresh coat of soft blue paint brightened the porch. Volunteers planted simple flower beds under the windows. Inside, a few students cleaned and repaired the old kitchen, scrubbing away years of grime until the counters gleamed. Walter worked harder than anyone, pushing himself until the sweat ran down his back. It wasn't just the house being repaired, it was something inside him too. Something that had long been left broken. During a break, one of the young veterans handed Walter a sandwich and said, "You fought for us. It's about time somebody fought for you." Walter blinked hard, the words hitting deeper than he expected. He hadn't realized how much he had needed to hear that. By late afternoon, as the sun began to dip low behind the rooftops, the house looked different. Not perfect, not new, but cared for, alive. And for the first time in a long while, Walter didn't feel invisible. He stood on the porch beside Keanu, looking out over the yard where the volunteers were packing up their tools, chatting and laughing like old friends. "It's still my house," Walter said quietly, a trace of wonder in his voice. Keanu smiled. "It always was. You just needed to believe it was worth saving." Walter looked at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Maybe I wasn't the only thing worth saving after all." Keanu didn't answer. He didn't have to. Sometimes, the strongest things were rebuilt not in silence, but in the sound of hands working side by side, hearts stitching something broken back together, one small act of kindness at a time. The following week, the changes kept coming, not just to Walter's house, but to Walter himself. One morning, Keanu pulled up to see Walter already outside. He was trimming the overgrown bushes that lined the front walk, a determined frown on his face and a small radio playing low from an open window. It wasn't much, a few clippings here, a cleared patch of dirt there, but it spoke volumes. Neighbors who had once passed by without a glance now stopped to chat. Mrs. Palmer from 2 doors down brought over a pie. A boy on a bike waved as he zipped past. The world was noticing him again. And Walter, slowly, cautiously, was letting them. Inside the house, the kitchen smelled of coffee again. Walter had started cooking real meals instead of heating canned soup. A local church group donated a worn but sturdy kitchen table. Keanu helped him carry it in, setting it down in the center of the freshly cleaned kitchen. Walter stared at it for a long moment before reaching out to run his hand over the scarred wood. "Never thought I'd have a table worth sitting at again," he said, voice rough. "You do now," Keanu replied simply. Later, volunteers from the town's VFW chapter offered to replace the sagging back fence. Some of the teenagers who had helped paint the house came back after school, asking if they could plant a few flowers along the walkway. Little by little, the house became a reflection of something deeper, a man learning to believe that he still had a place in the world. One afternoon, Walter found a small package left on his porch. Inside was a framed copy of his military service photo, restored from the original battered print he had carried for so long. Beneath it, a simple plaque: Walter Briggs, a soldier, a survivor, a story worth hearing. Walter stared at the gift for a long time, emotions warring behind his eyes. Then he quietly hung it on the living room wall, right above the small table where Keanu had placed a fresh vase of wildflowers. Keanu stopped by one evening just as the sun was setting. He found Walter sitting on the porch steps, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. Walter looked over and gave a small, almost shy smile. "Didn't think I'd ever see it like this again," he said. "Didn't think I'd want to." Keanu sat beside him without saying a word. Sometimes there was nothing better to offer than quiet company and an open heart. The lights inside the house glowed warmly behind them. Music drifted softly from the kitchen radio. A slow, hopeful tune carried on the breeze. For the first time in decades, the house wasn't just a shelter from the world. It was becoming a home again. And Walter wasn't standing at the edge of life anymore. He was stepping back into it. One repaired fence, one cleaned window, one awkward conversation, one act of kindness at a time. Because sometimes healing doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes it happens exactly the way Walter's house had been saved. Slowly, stubbornly, beautifully. Piece by piece. And Keanu knew, deep down, that the best was still to come. Walter sat on the porch, his hands trembling slightly around the mug of coffee he'd barely sipped. The evening was cool, the air heavy with the scent of fresh-cut grass and distant wood smoke. Keanu had gone home hours ago, leaving him alone with the weight of the moment approaching. A dusty blue car pulled up to the curb. Walter stood, almost against his own will, as the door opened. A woman stepped out, holding something tightly to her chest. It was Sarah. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy braid. She looked older than he remembered, but somehow more beautiful too, worn not by bitterness, but by life lived fully. He could see so much in her eyes: caution, sadness, hope, and a flicker of the stubbornness he remembered from when she was a little girl. For a long moment, neither moved. Finally, Sarah gave a tentative wave. Walter nodded stiffly. Words jammed in his throat. And he didn't trust his voice enough to use it. Sarah approached slowly, her steps careful, like someone walking across ice that might crack at any moment. She didn't rush forward to hug him. She stopped a few feet away and held up the object in her hands. It was a photo album, worn at the edges, its cover faded from years of handling. "I thought maybe," she said, her voice thin, uncertain, "we could look at some of these." Walter blinked hard against the sudden burning in his eyes. He stepped aside and gestured toward the porch steps. They sat down, side by side but not touching. Sarah placed the album between them and opened it carefully. The first photo was of her as a baby, Walter in uniform holding her awkwardly, as if afraid he might break her. "I remember this day," Walter whispered hoarsely. I was so scared. I didn't even know how to hold you right." Sarah gave a tiny, watery laugh. "You did okay." They turned the pages together. A birthday party with lopsided cake. A Christmas morning with a crooked tree. Photos of Sarah at school recitals, softball games, family picnics. Moments Walter had half forgotten in the long fog of depression and guilt. Moments he realized he had been there for, even if he hadn't always been present in the way she needed. Walter said after a while, staring at a photo of Sarah in her cap and gown. He hadn't been at that graduation. He'd barely been anywhere, trapped inside a prison built by memory and regret. Sarah closed the album gently and looked at him. "You missed a lot," she said, not cruelly, just honestly. "But you didn't miss everything." Walter shook his head, shame clawing at him. "I missed your whole life. I'm sorry." Sarah was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "You're here now." The words were soft, almost fragile, but they carried the weight of forgiveness he had never dared hope for. Walter let out a shuddering breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He reached out, slow and careful, placing his weathered hand over hers, where it rested on the album. Sarah didn't pull away. They sat there as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the porch. A breeze stirred the pages of the album, lifting them like quiet, whispered memories. Neither of them rushed the moment. Neither of them tried to force what wasn't ready. But something new, something long broken, had begun to knit itself back together. It wasn't perfect. It didn't erase the past. But it was a beginning. And for Walter Briggs, for the daughter he had lost and found again, it was more than enough. It was hype. The porch light flickered on automatically as dusk deepened around them. The photo album rested between Walter and Sarah, neither one moving to close it. It felt like the right place for it. Open between them, a quiet bridge built out of memory and missed chances. Walter cleared his throat, nervous again. He felt like a young man on his first date, uncertain, clumsy, afraid of saying the wrong thing. "I wasn't strong enough back then," Walter said, his voice breaking a little. "I thought, if I stayed silent, if I kept it locked up, maybe it wouldn't hurt anyone else." Sarah didn't answer right away. She watched the twilight settle on the street, the way the last of the children's laughter echoed faintly from down the block. Finally, she said, "Sometimes silence hurts more." Walter winced. He deserved it. But he also felt strangely grateful for her honesty. He nodded. "I know that now." A long pause stretched between them, filled with the sound of a passing car and the low hum of crickets. Sarah shifted, pulling a small object from her jacket pocket. It was a crumpled letter, yellowed with age. She unfolded it carefully and handed it to Walter. "I wrote this to you when I was 10, she said, almost embarrassed, "but I never sent it." Walter unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. The handwriting was childish, looping and uneven. It said, "Dear Daddy, I miss you even when you're here. I wish you would come back, even though you never left. Love, Sarah." Walter bowed his head, tears slipping down his cheeks. He pressed the letter to his chest like it was something sacred. "I didn't know," he whispered. I thought I was protecting you from me." Sarah placed her hand gently on his knee. "You were just lost, and I didn't know how to find you." They sat like that for a long time, the night closing around them, the porch light humming softly overhead. Walter looked up at her, seeing not the child he had failed, but the woman she had become. Strong, compassionate, brave enough to sit here with him. "Is it too late?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah smiled through tears. "It's not too late for anything, if we're willing to start." Walter nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Sarah rose and stepped off the porch into the yard. She turned back and smiled at him. "Come on, old man," she teased gently. "You owe me a game of catch. You promised when I was 8. You still remember how to throw a ball, right?" Walter barked out a rusty laugh, surprised at the sound of it. He pushed himself to his feet, joints creaking, heart pounding. He wasn't sure his arm would cooperate. He wasn't sure he would get the throw right. But he would try. Because trying, showing up, that was what mattered now. He followed Sarah into the grass, the stars beginning to blink into view overhead. And for the first time in a very long time, Walter Briggs didn't feel like a broken man, pretending to be whole. He just felt like a father again. And that was enough. The morning sun filtered gently through the oak trees lining the town square, casting long, warm shadows across the pavement. Rows of folding chairs had been set up, simple and unadorned, facing the modest stone memorial at the center. There were no flashing lights, no news vans parked at the curb, no microphones shoved in faces or cameras capturing staged smiles. Keanu had been firm about that from the start. This wasn't for the world to see. This was for Walter. Family, friends, neighbors, and a few veterans from surrounding towns gathered quietly, many holding small flags or simple bouquets. Children clutched their parents' hands, sensing without being told that today meant something. Walter Briggs stood near the back at first, his hands fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. He wore his best clothes, neatly pressed, a small red poppy pinned to his lapel. Keanu approached him with a quiet smile and nodded toward the front row, where a seat had been saved with a simple card that said, "Reserved for Walter." Walter hesitated, then, with a deep breath, made his way forward. Each step felt impossibly heavy and impossibly light all at once. He passed familiar faces, people he thought had long forgotten him. But here they were, offering nods of respect, small smiles of encouragement. Sarah was there too, standing just behind the first row, her eyes shining with quiet pride. Keanu stepped onto the small wooden platform set up before the memorial. He didn't need a script. He didn't even need a microphone. His voice, low and steady, carried across the square. "Today," Keanu began, "we gather not to celebrate battles fought, but battles endured. Not the victories that made headlines, but the victories fought quietly in the spaces between the years." He glanced over at Walter, who lowered his head humbly. "We honor a man who carried more than his share of weight," Keanu continued, "who walked a road most of us could not begin to understand, and who, despite everything, never let go of the small, stubborn hope that healing was still possible." Sophia stepped forward, holding a small box wrapped in a simple navy blue cloth. Keanu opened it carefully, revealing a medal, unlike any official award. It was inscribed simply, "For acts of quiet survival and strength." The medal shimmered softly in the morning light, more beautiful for its simplicity. Keanu called Walter to the platform. For a long moment, Walter didn't move. Then Sarah stepped forward, offering her hand. Walter took it, letting her lead him those last few steps. Keanu pinned the medal onto Walter's jacket, just above his heart. Walter stood straighter than he had in years, his eyes glistening, his chest rising with a breath that felt clean for the first time in decades. The crowd remained silent, reverent. Then one person clapped. Then another. Then another. Soon the small square was filled with warm, rising applause, not the kind that erupts out of obligation, but the kind that rises out of gratitude, real and deep. Walter didn't cry. He just smiled, a soft, true smile, as he looked around at the faces gathered there. He wasn't forgotten. He never had been. He had simply needed someone to remind him he was still here, still seen, still worthy. After the applause faded, Walter stepped down from the platform, the medal pressing gently against his chest, like a heartbeat he had almost forgotten he had. Sarah met him halfway. This time there was no hesitation. She wrapped her arms around him, holding him tightly, and after a second's pause, Walter hugged her back. It was a clumsy, trembling embrace, but it carried all the weight of the lost years and all the hope of the ones ahead. People didn't rush them, they simply stood nearby, letting the moment stretch, unbroken and sacred. Keanu moved quietly through the gathering, greeting the volunteers, thanking the neighbors who had shown up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It was a reminder that healing was never a one-man battle. It took a village. Sometimes it took just one hand reaching out to start a chain reaction. The local school choir, made up of a handful of kids in mismatched clothes, stepped forward at Sophia's signal. Without fanfare, they began to sing "America the Beautiful." Their voices, uneven but earnest, filled the square in a way no grand production ever could. Walter wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and stood straighter, letting the music wash over him. Nearby, someone unfolded a small wooden plaque, unveiling it slowly. The town had quietly agreed to dedicate a section of the park in honor of all veterans who came home to battles no one else could see. The plaque read, "To those who carried invisible battles and walked quiet roads, you are not forgotten." The words were simple, carved carefully, with space left intentionally below them. Space for more names, space for more stories, space for more healing. Walter approached the plaque, his steps measured. He ran his fingers over the carved letters, tracing each word as if memorizing them. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Everyone present understood. Later, small paper tags and ribbons appeared around the plaque. Visitors wrote quiet messages on them. Need names of lost friends, words they wished they had said, silent thank yous to family members gone or far away. It wasn't a monument built of stone and grandeur. It was a living space, a space where memory, hope, and quiet resilience could live side by side. Walter stood there until the sun began to slip behind the trees, the sky softening into shades of gold and purple. As people slowly drifted away, leaving Walter some privacy, Keanu remained nearby, but didn't approach. This was Walter's moment, not his. Finally, Walter turned, his eyes catching Keanu's across the distance. He didn't say anything. He simply gave a small, respectful nod, the kind shared between soldiers who understood the weight of survival, of second chances, of silent victories. Keanu nodded back. In that small town square, under the shadow of oaks and the growing dusk, one man's life had been quietly stitched back together. Elastically, not perfectly, not magically, but enough to begin again. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. The new plaque arrived 2 weeks later. There was no fanfare this time, no official announcements, no grand speeches. It was installed quietly, early on a misty morning when the town was just starting to stir. Only a few workers and Keanu were there to see it lowered into place, nestled between two sturdy oak trees at the edge of the town square. The bronze caught the soft morning light, polished and new, but the words etched into it carried a weight far older than any ceremony could explain. To those who came home, carrying battles no one could see, you are not forgotten. The letters were deep, bold, unmissable. It was a promise, not just to Walter, but to every soul who had returned from battle carrying invisible scars the world didn't know how to honor. Walter arrived not long after, walking slowly, a cane tapping lightly against the sidewalk. He didn't rush toward the plaque. He stood a few feet away at first, as if unsure whether he had permission to approach something so sacred, so unexpected. Keanu waited off to the side, giving Walter the space he needed. Walter's eyes never left the words. His hands trembled slightly at his sides, his shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths he didn't try to hide. Finally, after a long moment, he stepped closer. The cane leaned against the nearest bench as Walter lowered himself carefully, knees stiff from years of carrying both visible and invisible burdens. He reached out, rough fingers tracing the lettering slowly, as if memorizing it by touch. Tears welled in his eyes, unashamed. He didn't bother to wipe them away. They were not tears of sadness. Not anymore. They were tears of recognition. Tears of a man who had spent decades wondering if anyone would ever understand what he carried, and realizing now, in the simple quiet of a small-town morning, that someone finally did. Walter rested his forehead gently against the cool bronze for a moment, breathing in deep, steadying himself. Behind him, more townsfolk began to arrive. Some older veterans in jackets decorated with faded patches, some younger residents wearing simple ribbons pinned to their shirts. No one spoke loudly. No one interrupted. They simply stood nearby, silent, respectful, witnesses to something deeper than history. Keanu moved closer, but didn't break the moment. Instead, he quietly placed a small bouquet of wildflowers near the base of the plaque. No card, no note, just a simple act of remembrance. Walter turned his head slightly, meeting Keanu's eyes across the short distance. There were no words needed between them. The plaque spoke for both, and spoke for all. Later that afternoon, Walter returned to the plaque once more, this time with Sarah by his side. She held his arm gently, guiding him through the growing number of townspeople who had stopped to admire the new tribute. Children rode their bicycles around the square. Young parents pushed strollers. A few elderly couples sat on nearby benches, nodding in quiet approval as they read the inscription. Sarah had brought something with her, a photograph, yellowed at the edges but still intact. It was a picture of Walter as a young man, standing in uniform beside his unit. The faces were proud, sunburned, smiling in that hard-earned way only soldiers knew. She tucked the photo carefully into a small frame and placed it beneath the plaque, weighed down by a smooth river stone. Walter watched her do it, eyes misting over again. "She found that in an old shoebox," Keanu said softly, standing just behind them. "Said she wanted to bring it here." Walter's voice cracked as he spoke. I didn't think any of them would want to remember." Sarah squeezed his hand. "We do, Dad. We just didn't know how." Walter lowered himself to the bench again, Sarah beside him, Keanu standing respectfully nearby. The three of them sat together as the day drifted on, letting the hum of life in the town square surround them. A little boy wandered up at one point, no older than 6, dragging his mother by the hand. He pointed at the plaque and asked, "Mama, who's it for?" The mother knelt, smoothing the boy's hair, and said, "It's for people who were brave, even when no one could see." Walter heard every word. For the first time, in what felt like a lifetime, he let a real smile break across his face. It wasn't wide, it wasn't grand, but it was honest. Keanu caught the moment and stored it quietly in his heart. Not every battle ended with a parade. Not every victory was marked with confetti or cheers. Some victories were quiet, tender, born from pain and perseverance, stitched together by the hands of people willing to show up even when the world had forgotten. Before they left that day, Walter traced the plaque once more with his fingertips, letting the words settle deep into his bones. He was not forgotten. None of them were. As he rose to leave, Sarah slipped her hand back into his, and together they walked away from the plaque, not with the heavy shuffle of regret, but with the slow, steady steps of two people ready to begin again. And somewhere deep in the old veteran's chest, the long, silent drumbeat of hope stirred to life once more. Walter stood at the small community center just outside town, his hand resting lightly on the frame of the door. The room inside buzzed quietly, a gathering of young veterans seated in a circle. Some leaned forward, eager. Others sat back, arms crossed, suspicious of the idea that talking could fix anything. Walter understood that look. He had worn it himself for years. Slowly, he stepped into the room, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. There was no announcement, no fanfare, just a few nods of acknowledgement and the subtle way the group shifted to make room for him. Tuesdays had become sacred in Walter's life again. Not the day of loneliness it once was, but a day of connection, small and steady. Each week he returned here, sharing pieces of his story, not to lecture, but to listen, to let others know they weren't alone. Sarah sat in the back corner today, a notebook in her lap. She wasn't a soldier, but she came anyway, smiling quietly whenever her father looked her way. Their relationship, though still fragile in places, had grown into something neither of them had dared hope for. Walter cleared his throat, drawing the group's attention. "No big speeches today," he said, a wry grin tugging at his lips. "Just stories." And with that, the conversations began. One young man spoke of nightmares he couldn't shake. A woman beside him admitted she hadn't called home in months because she didn't know how to explain the person she'd become. Another confessed he couldn't stand fireworks anymore. How the sound of celebration felt too close to the echoes of things he'd left behind. Walter listened to them all, nodding, never rushing. Then, when the room fell into a thoughtful silence, he shared a story of his own. Not about combat or medals, but about the long journey back to himself. About the mornings he couldn't get out of bed. About the guilt that clung to him like a second skin. About how survival was not just a matter of living, but a daily act of courage. "You're not broken," Walter told them quietly. "You're building something new, piece by piece." The group listened, some with tears they didn't try to hide. In the doorway, unnoticed by most, Keanu leaned against the frame, watching with a soft smile. He had come without an announcement, without the foundation banner or cameras. Just himself. Just a friend dropping by to see another friend doing something extraordinary. After the session ended, Walter walked over to Keanu, his steps slow but sure. "You're early," Walter joked. Keanu chuckled. Didn't want to miss the good stuff. They sat outside on the front steps as the afternoon sun dipped low. Sarah joined them, handing Walter a bottle of water and slipping onto the step below him. For a long moment, they simply watched the world go by. Families laughing, a kid riding a bike, an old couple holding hands. Ordinary life unfolding, precious in its simplicity. Walter turned the water bottle in his hands and said, "I used to think my story ended a long time ago." Keanu looked at him, steady and sure. "Turns out you were just getting to the good part." Walter smiled. A real one, wide and deep. He believed it now. He believed it because someone had stayed long enough to prove it. As the sun sank lower, painting the sky in bruised oranges and golds, Walter leaned back and stretched his legs carefully in front of him. His body carried the stiffness of age and old injuries, but there was a looseness to his posture now, a kind of peace that hadn't been there a year ago. Sarah watched him from her seat below, and Keanu noticed the way her eyes softened. She wasn't just seeing the man he used to be, she was seeing the man he had fought to become. Walter pulled something from the inside pocket of his jacket, a folded letter, the edges worn from being opened and closed countless times. He handed it to Sarah without a word. She opened it carefully, recognizing it as her own first letter, the one she had sent after seeing him on the news, the one filled with more pain than hope. She smiled, blinking fast against the sting in her eyes. "You kept it," she whispered. Walter nodded. "It was the first thing that made me believe maybe it wasn't too late." Keanu rose, brushing the dust from his jeans. "I'll leave you two to it," he said, giving Walter a firm squeeze on the shoulder. Walter looked up at him. "You coming next Tuesday?" Keanu grinned. "Wouldn't miss it." Sarah laughed quietly. "You know, Tuesdays used to be my worst day." Walter chuckled, a deep, rich sound that surprised even himself. "Guess we're rewriting that story." They sat there until the streetlights blinked on and the crickets took over the night. There were no grand speeches, no overnight miracles. Just a bench, a letter, a battered heart learning how to heal, and a Tuesday. One more Tuesday, and countless more to come. Some wounds don't bleed. Some heroes don't wear medals. But every soul who fought to survive deserves to be remembered. In a world rushing forward, it's easy to forget those whose battles continued long after the wars ended. It's easy to overlook the silent warriors, the fathers, mothers, brothers, and daughters who carried invisible scars home and fought every day just to keep going. Walter Briggs was one of them. A man who didn't ask for attention, a man who didn't seek praise, a man who simply needed someone to see him again, to remember that survival itself is an act of courage. That the road back from darkness is steep, but never impossible. Because someone showed up, because someone listened, because someone believed he was more than his mistakes, Walter found the strength to believe in tomorrow. One conversation at a park bench, one letter handed with shaking fingers, one Tuesday at a time. It reminds us that we don't have to move mountains to change lives. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give is our presence, a willingness to sit beside someone in their pain, a promise, spoken or unspoken, that they are not invisible. Walter's story is not just his own. It's the story of every person who has waited for hope. It's the story of every soul who just needed someone to stay. It's the story of what happens when we choose to be the kind of person who doesn't walk away. If you have ever helped someone heal by simply showing up, you already know the truth. You already know how powerful your presence can be. Maybe it was a parent you sat with, even when they had no words left. Maybe it was a friend who pushed everyone away but still found you sitting quietly beside them. Maybe it was a stranger on a bench who just needed someone to believe in them again. The smallest acts often leave the biggest marks. Today we invite you to share your incredible story below. Have you ever helped someone heal, not by fixing them, but simply by being there? Have you ever stayed when everyone else walked away? Your story matters. Your kindness matters. And someone out there may be waiting for a sign that it's not too late. Let's fill the comments with hope. Let's honor the quiet battles. Let's remember the Walters of this world, and the thousands more like him, who fought every day for a future they couldn't always see. And if you are carrying your own battles in silence, hear this. You are not forgotten. Your survival leaves strength. Your journey matters. Sometimes, the road back home begins with one person who refuses to stop believing in you. Just like Walter found his way back. Just like you can, too. Stay tuned for our next story. A widow of a fallen Navy SEAL struggles alone with grief and loneliness until a stranger changes everything. A story of love that refuses to die. Of promises kept beyond the grave. And of a world where no sacrifice is ever truly forgotten.